Good evening. My name is Stephen Whiteman, and I am Senior Lecturer in the Art and Architecture of China at the Courtauld. On behalf of my co-organizer, Dr. Austin Nevin, head of the Department of Conservation at the Courtauld, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the second of this year's Frank Davis Memorial Lectures. Thank you for joining us. The Frank Davis Memorial Lecture Series is an annual distinguished series established in honor of Frank Davis, a critic for Country Life magazine, through a bequest from the F.M. Kirby Foundation. Over the course of 5 lectures in autumn and spring terms, Art History Futures at the junction of the digital and material terms, we will present work from leading researchers who are using digital methods in art history and technical art history or conservation to think in new ways about our disciplines. We will explore how the digital and computational can be used to advance research and teaching at the Courtauld and in the field, and how new forms of data and digital methods are changing the questions art historians and conservators are asking by casting methodological and ethical concerns in new light. Finally, the series will highlight questions of issues of equity, access, collaboration, and community building that are raised through the often disparate networks of digital art and architectural history, and which are also broader concerns of teaching and research in the contemporary university. Last month, our first speaker, Dr. Emily Pugh of the Getty Research Institute, explored the centrality of the photographic image in the history and practice of art history, and how the transition to the digital image over the course of the last 20 years has changed the way we must think about the materiality and visuality of our most ubiquitous form of digital surrogate. Tonight, we will continue to think about the potential of digital photographs for changing the way in which we access, engage with, and think about objects. Though in this case, the images are from a satellite, not a camera on a copy stand, and our objects are architecture and landscape, specifically the architecture of detention camps in Xinjiang province in Western China, where the Chinese government is forcibly incarcerating Uyghur Muslims. This evening, we are joined by the Pulitzer Prize-winning architect and journalist Alison Killing to discuss her path-breaking work in this area. A RIBA certified architect trained at King's College, Cambridge, the Oxford School of Architecture, and the Architectural Association in London, Alison also holds an MA in Humanitarian Development Practice from the Center for Development and Emergency Practice at Oxford Brookes University. She is the founder of Killing Architects, based in Rotterdam, where since 2010, she has been pursuing a variety of investigative architectural projects, including Reconstructing the City, a study focusing on the response to the 2010 Haiti earthquake that seeks to understand humanitarian agencies' work to rebuild city neighborhoods post-disaster and why these agencies struggle to work in urban areas. Migration Trail, a 10-day-long online documentary following the journeys of refugees as they set off for Europe from North Africa and Turkey, tracking their journeys in real time via a mapped data visualization and podcast. And the Architecture, Investigative Journalism, and Documentary Series, a lecture and workshop series held at the New Institute in the Netherlands to train architects and journalists in spatial investigation techniques. In 2021, she won the Pulitzer Prize with Megha Rajagopalan of BuzzFeed News and developer Christo Buchtek for Xinjiang internment camps, about which she will be speaking tonight. A student of mine this week, when she heard that Alison would be speaking, described Alison as, quote, her hero. And I must say that I am in full agreement. Please join me in welcoming this evening's Frank Davis Memorial Lecture, Alison Killing.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here. So my name's Alison Killing, and as Stephen said, for the past 2.5, 3 years, I've been working on trying to locate and then to analyze this network of detention camps in Xinjiang, where when we started, it was believed that there were upwards of 1 million people detained. So just start to share my screen. So Xinjiang is a region in the northwest of China. It's home to about 25 million people, and it's a very large area. It's about 4.5 times the size of Germany. It's 4 times the size of Alaska. 4 times the size of California. and about the same size as Alaska. Of those 25 million people, about 40% are Han Chinese, which is the majority ethnic group in China. And then the others are Turkic Muslims. The Uyghur are the largest group, but there are also Kyrgyz and Tajik and Uzbek, Hui and Shibe, and Mongols, amongst others. So Xinjiang is a region that has only relatively recently been incorporated into China. It was first conquered under the Qing dynasty, so about 250 years ago. And even then it was only loosely integrated into the rest of the empire. It was home to a series of small military outposts, but otherwise it mostly continued to be run by local leaders who had been there previously. And so it's always, or for a very long time, it was kind of this only loosely integrated frontier zone, which served as a buffer between China and the countries to in the rest of sort of Central Asia. It's it's also incredibly resource rich. It has a lot of oil. It produces about 80% of China's cotton, and China in turn produces a large percentage of the world's cotton. It also produces a lot of the world's tomatoes. So, and then it's geopolitically in a very, very strategic position. It borders 8 other countries in Central Asia, and it's in a key place on China's Belt and Road Initiative, which is Xi Jinping's project to link China overland to Asia and Europe and Africa. It's, for example, it also has, it's a key point in connecting with Pakistan's ports. So geopolitically, it's very sensitive, or it's very strategically important. It has a huge amount of resource, and it hasn't always been part of China. The Uyghurs had a couple of periods of independence over the past sort of 150 years. The most recent one was briefly in the 1940s, and then that came to an end when the Chinese Communist Party won the Civil War and formed the People's Republic. And China then more formally included Xinjiang into the state. It became an autonomous region in 1955. But since that time, there have continued to be a lot of tensions between the Turkic Muslims who live in Xinjiang and the sort of Han majority. There's been a lot of discrimination around employment and in education. There have also been intermittent crackdowns on the practice of Islam. And so this group of factors sort of explain or start to explain why what is happening there now with this big campaign of oppression and detention, why that's happening. That you have this strategically very important region with a lot of resources. You have a group of people who are distinct from the majority in China, who are not Han Chinese, and which the Chinese Communist Party in itself finds quite threatening. And then they also have this history of independence. So over the past 10 years, what we've seen is this sort of increase in oppression in Xinjiang. It's sort of started off mostly to do with So one of the first things that we saw was this increase in the amount of surveillance. This is a street in central Kashgar in which a huge number of surveillance cameras have been installed. There were surveillance cameras placed throughout cities and throughout neighborhoods. We also saw the introduction of checkpoints throughout cities, so that when people would be, trying to go to the market just to simply buy food for the day, they would have to go through multiple checkpoints, getting their IDs checked, possibly getting their faces scanned, and possibly getting their phones also checked for signs of software that wasn't allowed. There's also been a huge amount of digital surveillance, so people having to install software on their phones to monitor what they were doing on that. And then, generally this just created an incredibly oppressive atmosphere. It made like normal life very, very difficult. And then in early 2017, there started to be rumors that hundreds of thousands of people were disappearing into camps. This was a policy that was introduced in sort of mid-2016 when Chen Changguo, who had been the head of the Communist Party in Tibet and had implemented a campaign of oppression there, became the head of the Communist Party in Xinjiang, and started to implement all of these oppressive policies there as well, including this massive escalation of what already existed. It was a long time before people were able to really investigate what was happening. It's very, very difficult to work in Xinjiang for a number of reasons. Firstly, because of the scale of the place. As I already said, it's like 4.5 times the size of Germany. But it's also, there's a lot of harassment of journalists, which makes the place very, very difficult to work in effectively. People would be detained. Local people who journalists tried to talk to would be threatened and ran the very real risk of being sent to camps. And so it was very difficult to work there effectively, let alone ethically. And so in mid-2018, I took part in a workshop about online investigations. And at that workshop, I met Megha Rajagopalan, who has become a frequent collaborator of mine and who was my co-author for this investigation. Megha had been, she had worked in China for several years for Reuters as a political correspondent, and then she had moved to BuzzFeed News, where she was the China bureau chief. So she had a huge amount of experience working in China and a huge amount of knowledge about it, including having reported on Xinjiang for quite some time. And in 2017, in the autumn, she had been the first journalist to go and visit one of the camps. Shortly afterwards, her visa came up for renewal and the Chinese government decided not to renew it. And so she had to leave. But at the same, following that, she was still very, very keen to continue working on this subject and felt that it was a very urgent one. And so when we met, we realized that we maybe had complementary skill sets to work on this together. Now, by the middle of 2018, the world kind of pretty much did know that there were camps and that something very bad was happening in Xinjiang. But at the same time, there was relatively little knowledge about what was happening. Certainly policymakers lacked good evidence of what was happening in Xinjiang. There'd been some great work done. There had been research by anthropologist Adrian Zenz. There'd been research by a researcher called Sean Zhang, who's based in Canada. And Sean having heard that these camps were out there, he had gone looking for tender documents and employment records and any sort of media reports that he could find. And he had been very successful in finding a lot of them and in tracking down the addresses on these tenders for central heating systems and adverts for employment adverts for guards for a new re-education centre, and taking the addresses on those adverts, tracking them down on satellite imagery, and he had managed to locate a whole series of camps. He'd found several dozen of them. At the same time, work by Adrian Zenz had led to estimates that actually there were about 1,200 of these camps in existence. And so, and 1 million people detained. And so with that gap between what was known and what we believed was out there, we wanted to try and find the rest of the network. Now, it's very, as I said before, it's difficult to work in China because of, in Xinjiang specifically, because of the scale of the region and also because of the lack of access. But what we realized was the satellite imagery could potentially help us to overcome both of those limitations. And crucially, it's a it's a source of information that the Chinese Communist Party can't control, because we were using American satellite imagery. And so after this workshop where Magda and I met, we stayed in touch, and I would occasionally spend a couple of hours researching sort of Xinjiang and the camps, and trying to think about techniques that we might use to be able to find the rest of the network. And my breakthrough came when I read an article in Wired, which talked about censorship in Baidu Total View, which is the Chinese version of Google Street View. And this article that I'd read, it talked about how industrial estates in the east of China were actually being censored in Baidu Total View. And they were being done in this really strange way, that somebody had taken the ground level imagery and in Photoshop had kind of like scrubbed over the chimney stacks of the industrial estate, leaving still behind like the shadow of this structure. And so it was very obvious that the imagery had been manipulated, and also that rather than hiding this thing, it almost drew attention to it. But what I realized was that if industrial estates in eastern China were being censored in Baidu, that it was almost certain that detention camps in Xinjiang would be as well. And so I went to look in Baidu at Xinjiang to see if I could find the same thing. Now, there were a handful of camps that had been found and which journalists had visited, and which made us very, very sure that those places really were camps. And so those were the places that I went to look at in the satellite imagery. Now, I'd hoped to find ground level imagery, but in fact, there was none in the vicinity of these places. But what I found instead was that as I was zooming in on the satellite imagery onto this camp location, suddenly this white square would appear, and then you'd zoom in again and it would be gone, and the satellite imagery would disappear as well, and it would be replaced by these gray reference tiles, it's the sort of standard map tiles that you see in Google Maps or Apple Maps. They typically have a light gray background. The roads will just be a simple line. Buildings will just be drawn in outline. And you know, that wasn't necessarily something sinister. Baidu lacked high resolution satellite imagery that allowed you to zoom right in. But this white square was strange. And it had seemed actually a bit like the map just wasn't loading properly. But then I zoomed out and I zoomed in again, and the same thing happened. And that shouldn't have happened the second time, because the tiles that made up that the part of the map I was viewing should have been in the browser's cache. And so there shouldn't have been any problems loading. And so I zoomed in and out a few more times, and I found the same thing kept happening. And so I realized, like, okay, like I can replicate this phenomena. And so I went to look at the other 5 locations that we had picked out as sort of test locations. And I found the same thing was happening there, that these white squares were appearing over the location. And at that point, we realized that we had a technique that we could probably use to try and find the rest of the network. So this is what it looked like at the single zoom level where this sort of mask tile appeared. And then this is the same location in Google Earth. And that was going to be our methodology, that we would find the locations of all of these mask tiles, and then we could go and look in another sort of satellite provider's imagery that wasn't censored, and we could see what was there. So that's what we did. We got funding from the Open Technology Fund, and we joined forces with developer Christo Bushek, who has a huge amount of experience in human rights issues, in collating data and social media and lots of other sort of sources of information, and in building databases around that and building the tools that help people like me to effectively analyze that. So he was a great asset to our team. He set to work and he mapped out all of the locations that had these mask tiles in Baidu. And I think I had expected that we would find maybe around 500,000, maybe 1 million at the outside. But in fact, he found 5 million of these mask tile locations, which is an absolutely huge number and was a much too big number that we could think about going through them manually. So what we did was to ask ourselves, well, what do you need in order to make one of these camps? And we realized that actually these places needed a few things. First of all, to build them, you would need to get a lot of materials there and heavy machinery, and you would need to get workers there. So these places probably needed to be near to infrastructure. They would need to be near to good roads. And we realized that there was a number of other things that they would need too, that, you know, just to run these places, they would need gas and water and electricity and internet. And it's much easier to get those things by connecting to a nearby existing services than it is to dig a channel 300 kilometers out into the desert to get those things. And so probably we thought those places are going to be near towns as well. We also realized that, you know, other things that the camps need, they need detainees, there are people who are going to be detained in them. And so for that reason, it makes sense that that sort of population center would be nearby. There would also need to be workers who work there, and those people would need to live somewhere. They would have families and children who needed to go to school. They would need to access services like healthcare. For all those reasons, these places were probably near towns and probably along roads. And so that's how we decided to narrow down our investigation. This is an image of sort of southwest of Xinjiang, and it's Kashgar Prefecture and Kyzyl. And this is sort of the road network that runs through it. And where the roads meet, there are typically towns. So in narrowing down our search to the towns and the major infrastructure, we managed to get the number of mask tiles that we needed to look at down to about 50,000, which is still quite a large number, but it was suddenly a much more manageable one. And what I did at that point was I started in Kashgar Prefecture, which is really the Uyghur heartland. And I started to go through these mask tile locations one by one with the tool that Christo had built on one screen, which superimposed the mask tile locations on Google Maps, and then Google Earth on the other screen, and panning through them, checking off each location as I went and marking whether there was anything there or not. I did about 10,000 in that first week. So it's a reasonable rate. And it meant that actually thinking about going systematically through 50,000 tiles wasn't completely out of the question. But in fact, having done 10,000 of them and having done Kashgar Prefecture, there were a lot of things that I learned that allowed me to refine the process. So what I found mainly was, having identified a lot of places that looked likely to be camps, I had learned the sort of all of the different sorts of characteristics of these sorts of places and the different ways that they might look. And the other thing that I had learned was where these places tended to be. And what we had found was that, sorry, my voice is going. What we had found was that they were very often on the edge of towns in industrial estates. And that's for the reasons that I gave before, that they have good access to services, they're close to towns, they're close to the town and close to the sort of roads. They have gas and electricity and water, and they also have plenty of land, which is ideal if you want to build a big new detention complex. So that allowed me to sort of refine the working method. And from having done Kashgar, I started to work in a slightly more organic way, checking each town and looking in the outskirts. I came to realize as well that there was a very clear distribution around the administrative areas, that each county tended to have one old detention centre and a camp. And so I kept a running list of which counties I had found these things in. And if there was a place that we hadn't found a camp yet, I knew that we needed to keep looking in that place, because that almost certainly was one. And in that way, we found, this is an industrial estate just near Artush, which is just north of Kashgar. And there are 3 detention centres here. This one, which is the sort of top right one, is a lower security camp. This here is more of a prison. And this one over here is actually still under construction as we speak. And that looks more like a detention centre, which is the sort of place that typically would be used for people awaiting trial or people under administrative detention, although that's not what's happening in Xinjiang now. It's very much part of the detention campaign. But using those techniques, the systematic version at first, and then sort of working more organically through the counties, we've come close to what we believe is the full network of detention camps in Xinjiang. At the moment, we're aware of 347 compounds, and some of those compounds contain multiple facilities. So they might contain a detention centre and a prison and a camp. So what I'm going to do now is just have a look at Google Earth and talk you through some of these camps and sort of show you what it is that we can see in the satellite imagery. So this is a school on the outskirts of Kashgar, or at least it was built as a series of middle schools. It was built as the number 4, 5, and 6 middle school, although I doubt very much whether it actually ever functioned as a school. It was built sort of through 2016. So yeah, we can see like early construction in sort of November 2016. Still ongoing in summer 2017. And then by autumn, this is October now, we're starting to see signs that this place is a camp, and that it's functioning, that it's working as a camp. So it's less important in this camp, but we can see that there's a fence around. It's not a very high security fence, which is why I say it's not such an important feature in terms of determining that this place is a camp, although you would expect that all of the camps have some sort of barricading around. But this isn't particularly heavy, and so it's not particularly noticeable. What we can see, though, is that the entrance to each of the sub compounds, there's a sort of little guard post and a barrier across the road. But the real thing that gives this place away at the moment is these cars which are lined up on the road just to the northeast. Cars weren't typically allowed in the compounds of the camps because there was security risk. And so, and at the same time, because these places were built in this very sort of quite makeshift way, this was built as a school and not a prison, so it didn't have this big external car park. And so these places the car parks needed to be improvised instead. And so what you would often find is that these cars would be spread along neighbouring roads, or they would take over patches of wasteland nearby. And these sort of impromptu car parks were a strong sign that a place was in fact functioning as a camp and not as the school or the hospital that it used to be. Now, this place is kind of typical of the early group of camps. So sort of starting like late 2016 and then going into 2017, a lot of the camps that we saw were repurposed schools and hospitals, or they were apartment buildings that had lain empty and were quickly taken over and quickly converted. We think that the government wanted to get get going quickly with the detention campaign. And so they took over the buildings that they had available to them. The schools and hospitals are already state-owned, and that actually just needed a small amount of renovation in order to be usable as camps. That barbed wire fencing could be installed, that there could be a small amount of work done on the interiors to fit security systems and to fit cell doors, for example. But in a matter of weeks or even days, they could then be functional as camps. So just going forward a little bit. So by the middle of 2018, we can see that this camp is starting to expand. And where there was previously a sports field, there are now this series of really quite big new buildings instead. So these, we can see that they're complete by August. And by the way, the construction process with these camps and in China generally was incredibly fast. So these buildings would typically be built in 3 or 4 months. We saw entire camps built in around 6 months. It's incredibly quick. But there's a few other features that also would help to identify this place as a camp. So the first one is these blue sheds, which are sitting next to the new buildings. We saw that in a number of sites across Xinjiang, that places that had previously been, say, apartment buildings, suddenly these blue sheds would appear squished in between the buildings, and they would be used to provide the larger spaces that an apartment building typically wouldn't have. So they would be classrooms or dining rooms or kitchens, things like that. In other places, they were also functioned as factories. And we'd see these blue roofed sheds appear on sort of in the middle of what had previously been a school sports field, or just here sort of in small spaces in between buildings and what had previously been a school. So that was also a key characteristic and a key giveaway of a place being a camp. The other one that I want to show you though is the fact that within the compound, we had a lot of fencing, sort of walling these buildings off from the rest of the compound. So you can see around each of these buildings, there's a fence that goes all the way around. If I go forward a little bit in time, we can also look into the back courtyards, and we can see that there's a series of pens adjacent to the facade of the building. And we believe that they would be exercise yards for the detainees. And then this is the last image that I'll show you of this camp. Over here, we can see a number of buses arriving on the site. They could be bringing new detainees to the place. They could also be picking people up to take them to a nearby factory for forced labor. And forced labor is endemic throughout Xinjiang, both in the camps, but also there's a huge amount of coerced labor outside in the form of so-called poverty alleviation programs. So they could be bringing people to factories. But the other thing that we can see here is that in front of this building, we have what appear to be groups of people lined up in these sort of quite strict military style formations, all wearing red uniforms. And seeing this sort of thing was also tended to be a sign that a place might be a camp. So this series of camps was really characteristic of the first stage. But this next one that I'm going to show you was very different. And I remember that there was a moment where we had expected that there were going to be 1,200 of these camps in existence, and most of the ones that we had seen at the point that we started work were like the school that I just showed you. And so as I started working, one thing that I noticed quite quickly and was really shocked by was that there actually seemed to be a huge amount of construction of these much bigger, much more permanent looking, much higher security facilities, like often really significantly larger. And I realized that this 1,200 number that we were looking for was almost certainly no longer true, that we were probably looking for a much smaller number of camps, and that also the strategy around the camps had shifted significantly. And this camp here, which is in Dabancheng, which is part of Urumqi district, which is the regional capital. This camp is really paradigmatic of that sort of second phase of the camps. So this was the region, this was the area where the camp is in 2015. There was nothing on the site. And then in March 2018, ground was broken to start creating this. So this is April 2018 that we're looking at. By July, the rest of this compound here had been filled in. And by October, an entire extra compound had been built next to it to extend it. So as I said, just an absolutely phenomenal speed of building. So zooming in, we can see some of the features that both make it a camp and also make it different from what we had previously seen. So the first thing is that we suddenly have these very thick concrete perimeter walls. This is 1.5 to 2 meters thick. It's about 7 meters high, and it has a walkway along the top. At the corners, there are guard towers, and there are also guard towers at significant points along the wall. So here they look down roads within the compound. There's one main entrance to the prison compound, which is through this building here. So it's incredibly tightly controlled. I think this must be an incredibly intimidating place to arrive at. If we look at the next compound, sorry. Sorry, what I'm looking at and what I got a little bit distracted by is it looks like some of the walls have been removed around this compound since I last looked. But that's something I'll look at later. We can actually see that there was previously a wall that continued along here, and it looks like this has now been replaced by a fence. We can actually see like the sort of structural elements, the pillars that hold up the fence, and then this line of the fence just here, which I think we're getting to see it at an oblique angle. So these buildings here, which have these sort of pale blue roofs, we believe that they're factories. And it became very common to see these factories in these compounds, not just sort of squished in between existing buildings or on the school sports field, which is what we'd seen before, but also to start to see like large numbers of factories in this very regular formation. So space had deliberately been made to house a lot of factories and provide space for forced labor. We can tell that they're factories largely because of the blue roofs. So the factories across Xinjiang, they look the same right across Xinjiang. They have metal frames, the steel frames, which means that you don't need columns in the middle, and that means that you have lots of space both to set up, manufacturing lines, assembly lines, or to accommodate large pieces of machinery. And we've actually seen these places under construction in a number of places, which is how we know that they really are steel framed. And then the roof is, I think it's powder coated steel, which is a common covering for a steel framed building, but it makes these very sort of brightly colored, distinctive buildings, which are quite easy to spot. So that's the sort of detention area of these camps. And then what we have at the front is an administrative area, the offices for the prison. And then also, I think over here we have housing for the guards and for the police who work there. And also sort of a massive car park out front to hold all of their cars. Now, when we started working on this, I mean, actually, sort of right through 2017, the Chinese government was denying that any of these places existed, even as rumors were starting to emerge, as I said, of hundreds of thousands of people disappearing into the camps. The Chinese government was denying all knowledge of them. By 2018, that was becoming more difficult to maintain. And the story had changed, and the Chinese government was saying, well, these camps do exist, but actually they're providing vocational training. They're to help people who perhaps don't have very much education or very much skills. We're going to teach them Chinese, which will open up a much larger range of jobs to them. We're going to teach them skills like factory work so that they can get good, well-paying jobs. There's a number of reasons to doubt that story. Many of the people who were detained at the beginning were the highly educated people. They were sort of the elite of Xinjiang society, and they were like the real pillars of the society. They were the imams, they were business leaders, academics, the people who really sort of shaped cultural and intellectual and economic life in the region. And these were the people who were selected initially to go into these camps. Many of the people were forced to do these Chinese language lessons. In fact, many of them already spoke fluent Chinese and they had no need of such lessons. But also there's this very strong element of coercion which brought them there. People would be arrested and handcuffed and blindfolded and taken to these places. They're then also not allowed to leave. It just really sort of undermines the claims that these are about vocational education and that it's a benign program. I should say as well that the things that got people sent to these camps were not things which are illegal, like they're not illegal in China. It would be things like people having WhatsApp on their phones, having traveled abroad would get people put on, would draw a lot of suspicion to people. Men who were particularly religious, perhaps they wore a beard, women who wore hijab. It was, people who instructed their children on what was halal, that they shouldn't eat pork or drink alcohol, for example, listening to Arabic music, or having Arabic or watching Arabic videos on their phones. All of these were seen as signs of extremism and which needed to be tackled through being sent to the camps. This is something that we know because of leaked documents. There were leaked documents both from Aksu and from Kazakhs counties, which actually gave a full database of individuals who had been detained and the reasons for their detention. So anyway, back to what the Chinese government was saying about these places. By 2018, they were saying that these are vocational schools. A lot of reasons to doubt that. By the end of 2019, the story had changed again, and the Chinese government was saying, and in fact, the governor of Xinjiang announced in December 2019 that all of the camps had closed. And yet, through our work, we were very skeptical of that, because what we could see was that, in fact, camps were continued to be built and they were being completed just as he was making this announcement. And in fact, this camp, which we believe can hold around 32,000 people. When I zoom out, we get a different image and you can see what was previously this heavy perimeter wall. But this camp, which we believe can hold around 32,000 people, by December 2019, January 2020, we saw the completion of this new compound just to the southwest. And this is a medium security prison, which we believe can hold around another 10,000 people. I'll quickly show you some of the features of this. we know that it's medium security because it has this single layer of barbed wire on either side of the perimeter wall. And that's a thing that we managed to get hold of Chinese prison and detention center building regulations, which described all of the different security measures that you needed in order to make different sorts of detention facility. And this was a key thing which differentiated medium and high security prisons, this single layer of barbed wire. We can see from this building that there's this barbed wire passageway leading to this building. And then on the other side, that there's another passageway leading out and to this building. So this is probably where detainees enter the complex and are processed. We can see that there are these tall masts on within the compound, largely because we can see their shadows, and they probably hold both lighting and also other surveillance equipment like cameras. And then over here, this is a guard building, and leading from it and to the perimeter wall, there's this elevated walkway. We can see that because we can see the shadow, and there's like one support in the middle to hold it up. And that walkway is giving access to the walkway on top of the perimeter wall, and it also gives access to the guard towers. And this was how we would identify a guard building. What we can also see is that the sports facilities for the guards, which are in the space in front. And the same in this one over here. So last week, Monday morning, I woke up to a series of messages from my colleague Mega, and also from a number of Chinese journalists. And what they were talking about was this video that had appeared on the internet, which was posted about in the middle of October sometime. But, and I think it'd been doing the rounds on Chinese social media, but then last week sort of made the jump to Western social media as well. And what it was, it's a Chinese activist and vlogger who goes by the YouTube name Guan Guan. And he had decided that he would travel to Xinjiang, taking this map, which was in the first article that we published when we published what we believed to be the full network of camps. He took this map here and went together with Baidu Maps, and he went to Xinjiang, intending to try and find as many of the camps as he could, and to just see what was there. And he took video throughout. So he visited 8 different towns, and he went to 18 different facilities. And it's incredibly useful what he did. It's when we're using satellite imagery and we're trying to verify things. I mean, I've already showed you some of the sort of key elements that we would look for to try and identify the camps. But actually, what we really want on top of that is a further measure of corroboration. We would be looking for, maybe we would have an eyewitness, somebody who had been detained there, who could show us on Google Maps where they had been detained, and we could corroborate that way. Or maybe we could get tender documents, which as sort of Sean Zhang had, and as he had, and which he had used to sort of find these places in the first place, that could corroborate a camp. Or maybe a media report would help too. But this sort of ground level imagery is also just incredibly useful, not just because it helps us to corroborate places, although it did, and this guy actually helped us to corroborate a number of places for which we didn't have other evidence than just the satellites. But it's also useful because it helps us to understand what we're looking at from above. And it sort of helps to tell us that what we thought we were looking at when we were looking at the satellite image, and sort of when we were imagining what that 2-dimensional image must look like in 3 dimensions, this ground level imagery can help us to confirm if our interpretation was correct or not. So it was incredibly useful. And the first place that this guy went to was Hami, which is in Courtauld, which is in the east of Xinjiang. And the camp that he visited is this building over here on the right, behind this railing with all of the flags on. And as he drives a bit further, you actually get to a gate post where there's a sign which confirms that it's a camp. The first few places that he went to, many of them he could put his phone on the dashboard and sort of drive past and look. Just reasonably, it's absolutely not without risk, this sort of drive-by filming, but it was relatively safe. And I say relatively because he then became much bolder, and I'm absolutely in awe of this guy's bravery. So having visited Hami, he then drove north and went to a place called Mori, where he actually walked across the fields towards this detention center to see what was there. And so again, we can sort of see this place up close. We can see the perimeter walls. We can see that there's a walkway along the top here. We get to see the guard towers, the windows which have bars on them. Really, really interesting and useful to see. And then he also went to visit this camp, Dabancheng, which was the one that I was showing you in satellite imagery just now. And this is actually the new compound that was built through 2019 and opened at the end of 2019, start of 2020. And this one was actually amazing to see, because there is relatively little imagery of this place, despite it being a very well-known camp. And this new part in particular, I'm not aware of any other imagery of it. So what really shocked me when I saw this imagery was watching the video. I was able to sort of track where it was that he was driving, and he drove up this gravel road where there really isn't anything at all. And I think it's really just used for access for construction vehicles to the prison. And he drove up this dirt road, got out of his car at one point, and then climbed up on this sort of sand berm, which overlooks the camp. This was incredibly brave, because this just isn't a place that tourists go. And being out there, if he had been caught, there would be no plausible deniability around what he was doing. Absolutely, he was there to look at and film the prison. And so I'm both incredibly impressed by how courageous he was, but also like very thankful that he went out and did this work. So last week, what I spent time doing was looking at the video, analysing it, because I wanted to corroborate the locations that we had in our database, and also to verify the video so that it would be more difficult for people to say that it was fake. And so the way that I did that was to go through and sort of take stills of the video, and then to try and identify features in the video stills, which I could then see on satellite imagery. So this red box over to this side, that was the guard tower. That was the guard building that I was pointing out to you before, which could be seen here in this red rectangle here. And this mast in yellow, we can see it right here. The way that I'm trying to do this is I'm looking to sort of see what I can find out about each of these elements from the satellite imagery. The mast is a sort of key one that I'm looking for something like very long and very tall, and then sort of identifying several things that it could be, but then also looking for other elements that I can identify. For example, the wall with the guard tower, and then looking at how these different elements relate to each other, and therefore exactly what is what within the image, and where the viewer is standing. And in that way, we can see whether the the video evidence matches the satellite and verify that it's correct. So this is having found all of these locations. What we wanted to do next was to start to analyze them, and this is a facility in Mongol Kure, which is in Ili prefecture in the northwest of Xinjiang, and in this place we had we knew of a series of detainees who had been held here. And so in order to try and understand what was happening, we did a number of things. We wanted to make a three-dimensional model that we could use to help ourselves understand, and which we could also then show to readers to sort of help to explain to them what this place was like and what was happening inside. And then we did a huge number of interviews as well. And we kind of worked back and forth between the two things. So this is actually just a part of the site. This is an old detention center here. And then in 2017, a new part was built, which is this small group of buildings, which is what we see here in this slide. And we sort of focused in on this, which, because we had like a number of people who we knew had been held there. And we sort of, the way that we worked was to start off with using the satellite imagery and trying to work out from there as much as we could about what this building looked like. We could tell sort of how long it was and how wide it was. And then by looking at different satellite imagery, sometimes we would get an oblique view where we would be able to see the windows in satellite imagery. And so we could, from that, work out the number of stories. In other places, we weren't as lucky to have those side views and views of the facade. And so we had to use the shadows and calculate the heights of buildings from that. But here we were able to see the facade quite well, and we were able to count the windows, both counting the number of stories and counting how many windows there were running the length of the facade. And from there, I was able to sort of make a good guess about what the structural grid was likely to be and the circulation within the building. And then also other things within the satellite imagery were these barbed wire pens that we had been able to see in the satellite photos. And with this, we were able to go back to the detainees and start to have some conversations, asking them both what the things were that we could see, and also at points where we had got stuck, we had the tools with which, I mean, the model had both raised those questions and also given us the tools to start answering them. And so in conversations with the detainees around this model, we were able to find out a huge amount about what day-to-day life in these buildings was like. So for example, we learned that there were different exercise yards for different categories of prisoner. Most of the people that we spoke to in the course of our work have been in the lowest security level, which is actually also why they've been let out again and have been allowed to even leave the country. But there were other much more much higher security categories where people, for example, would remain shackled all the time, which is something that the detainees that we spoke to told us. And so these pens were for different categories of detainee. They also told us that they didn't get to go out to these places very much. They went out maybe once in 6 weeks. And so, you know, they very rarely got fresh air. They very rarely got to feel the wind or sort of the sun. They really stayed inside almost all of the time, which created an incredibly claustrophobic experience, I imagine. But then, like within the building, having sort of worked out what the structural grid was likely to be, we could also start to ask questions about that. So one of the main things that we wanted to know was how many windows there were in a cell. And the detainees told us that there was actually only one window in each cell. And suddenly from that, we were able to work out from there, like how big the rooms likely were and how many of them there were, one per window. We were also able to sort of measure the size of the room and to see that when we went and looked at the Chinese prison construction standards, such a space should only have been big enough for maybe 3, perhaps 4 people at a push. But in fact, people told us that there were like 10 or so people being held in a single cell. We often heard stories of this overcrowding, of there not being enough beds for people having to share or to sleep on the floor, and really poor overcrowding. We also learnt, about, they told us about the bathroom facilities that were available to them. It was actually just, there was a toilet just in the corner of the cell, which everyone used. There was very little privacy. And then on top of that, there was also very little privacy from the guards. So there were cameras everywhere. There were cameras in all of the cells, and they covered every inch of that space. There were also microphones which would pick up whatever people said, so that if they were heard talking their native language and not Mandarin, then they would be shouted at over the guards by who would shout at them over the loudspeakers, and sometimes they would be punished as well. They would be people were beaten for speaking their own languages. There was a classroom in, I think there was possibly one on each floor, but there was a classroom where people were supposed to go for lessons, and yet because there was so much overcrowding, they went there only like quite infrequently, and most of the time instead they were expected to stay in their cell. They would be expected to spend the day sitting on these sort of narrow plastic stools. They would get shouted at over the speakers if they slouched. They would be expected to sit and study Xi Jinping thought. And so, beyond that, we also know that people were often fed very, very poorly. There have been very credible accounts of torture, of people being put in solitary confinement, of being locked into these tiger chairs, which is this sort of iron chair where people's arms and legs are restrained, and being left there for sort of 24 hours. But in fact, despite all of the sort of physical deprivations, many people sort of found that, the living in this very, very constrained environment was incredibly challenging, and caused a huge amount of trauma. And the other thing was that people actually struggled with a huge amount of shame as a result of being imprisoned and having done so for when they believed that they hadn't done anything wrong, and they really struggled psychologically with that. So this is the model that we finally were able to build, looking inside this facility. People slept on bunk beds. There weren't always enough of those. When people went to the classroom very infrequently, they would sit at these desks and they'd be separated from the teacher by a wall, and then sort of an electrified wire fence as well often. It's closer. So yeah, I think I'll leave things there, and we can maybe move to questions.
Thank you so much, Alison, for that very rich and very detailed look at your work. I'm really, I want to start by just saying thank you, of course, and also to invite, there are a few brief questions that cropped up as you spoke, which I'll come to in just a second, but also to invite all of our attendees to share their questions in the chat, and I will go through them in just a second. While people are thinking about their questions, I just wanted to ask a few questions of my own to sort of kick this off. And the first is that this is one of the reasons I really wanted to invite you is not only because of the importance of the work and also its connections to fields that we now teach at the Courtauld, of course, but also thinking more broadly about the field of architectural design and architectural history. Your work fits or sort of is part of trends or other practices in things like forensic architecture and schools of architecture that look at architecture in war zones. And I just wondered whether you could reflect for a moment on how you understand this type of work as a form of architectural practice. Because I mean, I am not an architect and have not been to architecture school, but on the whole, this seems different from what I imagine happens in your average architectural studio.
Sure. So, I mean, I think the main difference between what I do here and what architecture students would typically do at schools and what sort of practicing architects would do on a building project is that I guess it's like the propositional part at the end that is taken away, whereas actually like I'm not sort of doing all of this work and then I'm going to design a building or sort of develop a strategy around it, which is, you know, what architecture students are usually building to in their work. You know, that's what I would say the main difference. And beyond that, you know, a lot of like the research that we do at the beginning of a project, and also sort of just the way of thinking and the way of working, I think is something that architects do still recognize as being very architectural. I mean, yeah, I mean, there's a number of ways that comes out. There's some very direct things like when we were looking at, we did some work sort of through the first half of this year where we were trying to calculate the capacity of these camps. And to do so, I sat down and I actually drew all of them, like in sort of a schematic outline, and used that to calculate the gross floor areas of these camps. And then we got hold of the Chinese prison building regulations and used the numbers in that to reverse engineer what the capacity was likely to be. So that came out at about 1,014,000 people without overcrowding. And so that sort of, those sorts of skills are very architectural, that sort of knowledge of like, okay, this is how those buildings ought to have been built. They would have been built to certain regulations, let's go and find the regulations. That's the sort of knowledge that I think is common to architects. Beyond that, I mean, the work that we're doing is very spatial as well. So, you know, the knowledge of urban planning of like, where is it that we should be looking for these places? What do these places need? Or they need services, where would we find those? I think is a very urban planning view of the world. And then, you know, the ability to think in 3 dimensions is very helpful when you're looking at satellite imagery and trying to understand what that is and what it means.
Yeah, I was struck by the combination in both what you described, but also in your talk, of digital methods, but also sort of, you know, good old-fashioned close looking. I mean, a lot of very detailed work that produced raw material from visual images that figured into the creation of models, for instance, or the creation of drawings, or the calculation of capacities, like you talked about. Could you just, stepping back a second to the digital part, can you tell us a little bit more about Christo's involvement and how he went about, as I understood your description of that portion, that he developed a system for scanning large areas of land for examples of this sort of white square problem? And is that, do I have that correct? And could you tell us a little bit more about the sort of algorithmic or the process? Or maybe I've got that wrong.
Okay, I can't talk too much about this. The challenge in working in China is that when you give up a method, when you sort of make a method public, you lose access to it. And that's been a big challenge for us. But it has been for all researchers working in China. Yeah, I mean,
okay. Well, go ahead. I mean, tell us what you can. I don't want to pry. That's an important issue that you've raised. That I'm glad came out anyway.
Yeah. I mean, Christo built one of the things that Christo is very experienced in, and which was really incredibly valuable to us while doing this project, is building the tools to help analyze the data set and to build a tool specifically around the questions that you're trying to answer and the needs of those specific researchers and of that data set. So yeah, I mean, he built a tool that allowed us to superimpose the mask tile locations on Google Maps, so we could sort of navigate that easily and visually, and then link that to a database so that we could be adding markers of suspicious locations and sort of annotating that. And having that sort of tool built for us really, building your own tools is really helpful for a couple of reasons. It's really helpful when you need to collaborate, because you can often find a tool that will do the thing, but it will only do the thing on desktop. So if several of you want to be working together, you actually need something built specially. And the other thing that it can do is to really reduce bottlenecks in a workflow, make things more efficient. So yeah, he did a great job with that.
Thank you very much. One of the as we think a little bit about digital methods in architectural and art history or in contemporary analysis, I ask these questions in part because I'm very interested in the sort of juncture between the digital and just looking. Like at some point, you need to take this data set and begin to work your way through it and understand what the individual pieces were. And so the idea of thinking about you looking at 10,000 examples in a week is not so different from going to an archive and pulling off paper, except that you developed that archive in a different way. And that's really
yeah, you've got like this big pile of stuff, and when you're sort of starting to look into it, you're starting to just try and understand what's there in that big pile of data, and then you're also starting to think as you do it about the questions that you want to answer and how that data could be organized in a way to help you answer them. Yeah.
Thank you.
I imagine it's very similar.
Well, I have a lot of other questions, but there are a ton of questions now appearing in the chat. So I'll start to go through some of them. Just a very basic question to start with, thinking back to the first Google Earth camp that you showed us on Google Earth, where you noted the rows of cars that are parked outside. Who do those cars belong to?
Oh, we think they would belong to the workers at the camp. So the guards. Yeah.
So people who don't live on site, or who maybe do live on site but need cars.
I don't think that those people lived on site at that place.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. That's sort of what I thought, but then I had the same question actually. Are there another attendee asked, are there photographic documents of camp life or witnesses? Now you talked a little bit about people who you interviewed. How did you come to, I mean, in addition to that question, how did you come to interview the people that you spoke to?
So the people so Mega did most of the work of sort of finding these people and sort of doing all of the interviewing. She did this really fantastic job with that. A lot of these people, as I said, they were sort of the lower security sort of people who were deemed to be less threatening. And so after a stint in the camps, many of them were released. Initially, that might have been to home detention or to sort of like this community control. But at a certain point, many of them were allowed to leave the country. From, I think, sort of like very early in the campaign, there were Uyghur people who had been in the camps and who were able to leave the country, and sort of maybe go to Turkey or to go to Europe. But then later, I think that became much more difficult. And then we had, what we started to see then was that actually most of the people who are able to talk about this are Kazakhs. They were, ethnic Kazakh people who had grown up in Xinjiang, but they maybe their partner was a Kazakhstan national. Perhaps they had lived in Kazakhstan and had permanent residency there. Those people, when they were released, were often allowed to go to Kazakhstan. And so there's a community in Almaty, which is in the sort of southeast Kazakhstan, not far from the border with China. And there's a sort of community of people there who were previously detained. And there's sort of institutions that work with that group of people. And so we met them, or Mega met them. And that's how we found out what was happening in the camps. As far as sort of documentary, sort of photographic evidence, there have been these sorts of guided tours that the CCP has provided to journalists to go to the camps. They would be very heavily controlled. They're typically to the lowest security places. It wasn't possible to speak to any of the detainees unsupervised. A lot of the articles that I'm aware of that came out of those sorts of visits, the main ones that I'm aware of were from sort of Chinese state media, such as the Global Times. And so they show things like, here's everyone sort of like enjoying a Mandarin class, or look, here's all of the detainees playing volleyball on their break. Here they are sort of taking a sewing lesson and then giving an interview talking about how valuable this is and how they're really hopeful for the future and excited because now they don't have to do low-paid farm work. So there is sort of visual evidence of what goes on, of what is happening inside the camps, but it's we should be very, very skeptical of that evidence. There has been, however, a couple of leaked videos which were taken by construction workers of these places that, as they were under construction. Again, like hugely brave people who took these videos and leaked them. And they show, those videos were actually also really useful in the work that we did in Mongol Kure, trying to reconstruct one of these camps, because they would show, the security facilities, the cell doors, which were often like double doors, the heavy level of barricading, the sort of bars on the windows and things like that. So there's resources out there, some of which we should be very skeptical of, but others which is much more credible. And we just then need to try and piece those together based on those things.
That raises another issue there. I'm going to continue with questions in a moment, but just to sort of think more about that you talked a lot about, which is the importance of construction, evidence of construction, in understanding architectural problems, and it makes an interesting connection between your project in that regard, not only in its broad subject matter, but also specifically in that, and work by an architectural historian in America named Paul Jaskett on the architectural industry under the Third Reich and the construction of concentration camps, and the forms of labor and supply networks and things like this. And many of the same questions that you also thought about, which I thought were such an interesting deductive choices around the necessity of their position relative to utilities or supply chains or cities, especially because Xinjiang is not a terribly hospitable place outside of certain portions of it. It was really, really an interesting series of choices that you made. One of the next question, the Chinese government has, as you noted, has said that people are now integrated, that many of the people who are being detained are becoming integrated into Chinese society. do you believe, aside from your skepticism about that sort of general assertion, do you believe there will be a continuous rising in or growth in the number of detention centers, or do you expect over time? Can you predict a trajectory to this, or do you expect a continued growth in this? I guess a different way of asking this question is, what sort of rate of growth has there been over, say, the last 6 months?
Yeah. So this sort of mass detention campaign, we think sort of kicked off in late 2016. That's the sort of first point at which we started to see satellite evidence of places being converted to camps. Through 2017, we saw a huge amount of building, both of the sort of earlier makeshift camps opening, but also more permanent facilities. And then in 2018, we also saw, again, like an absolutely huge amount of building. It actually, it peaked in 2018. Through 2019, we continued to see building, but at a much slower pace. But the places that were built through there were these really, really big prisons, sort of big enough to hold about 10,000 people, and sort of quite high security facilities. And it's continued to, there were again like a small number of places that were built through 2020, and there's one or two that I'm aware of in 2021. They're not, I suspect that Xinjiang may have reached its capacity of detention facilities. As I said, we calculated that just in the post-2016 program, because there were already a lot of prisons which existed prior to 2016, but just the places which were either built new or significantly expanded after 2016, they could hold over, they have the capacity to hold over 1 million people. And that's not including overcrowding, which we know existed widely. Yeah, I mean, and I should say as well, like 1 million people, that's like 1 in 25 of Xinjiang's population. It's just an absolutely staggering proportion of people that that they would be looking to detain. As for people being released, I mean, we know that some people have been released because we've spoken to them. But when we haven't seen evidence of sort of like the mass release that you would expect around, oh, these camps are closed. We've seen sort of like early releases, often into forced labor program, often into sort of other forms of coerced labor. Yeah, and what we also know is that as well as having this massive capacity to detain people, we've also seen a massive increase in Xinjiang in people being sentenced to prison and being sentenced to very long sentences, disproportionate to what's happened in Xinjiang previously and massively disproportionate to what's happened elsewhere in China.
I want to thank you. I want to skip a couple. I want to reassure the people who may be watching their questions in the chat that I'm going to come back to the questions that I'm skipping, but I want to just on that subject continue on a little bit. One person has asked about whether you have heard about rumors of centers being built underground. And what you think of, I suppose, and what you think. And what I think of
those. I have heard of some of that. I think there's two things going on there. The first thing that I would say is that I don't think that they need to build these places underground. I think that they're it's really tempting to believe when such an appalling thing is happening, such like egregious human rights abuses, that it's necessarily out of sight, or that people necessarily in the region necessarily don't know about them. I don't think that either of those things, in fact, are true. Although, you know, the Chinese government, I think, did try and conceal to a certain extent what was happening there, and has gone through a series of waves of denial about what's happening. But there's a huge amount of evidence still making its way out that this is happening, and I think. And there's also sort of as much as we have seen them need to shift strategies slightly in the way that they've been talking to the rest of the world about this, I think that I don't think that they need to sort of deny. I don't think that they feel the need to deny completely that this is happening. You know, that there's a certain show of power in sort of just saying, like, in just sort of issuing these denials when we can see these things in the satellite imagery. There's also and I mean, they also have these other stories about what's happening there, about you know, it's to tackle extremism. Actually, all of these people are criminals. We're helping these people by giving them training. You know, there's all of these other narratives around it, which are about diversion and rather than outright denial and concealment. And the other thing about them potentially being underground is that I have had people sort of at times sort of like email me an address and email me Baidu coordinates. And what happens there is that they'll have an address and it'll be like 63 Textile Avenue, which is the address of one of the big prisons in Aksu. But Baidu doesn't have, or it doesn't seem to allow the full functionality around searching with addresses that you would have in, say, Google Maps if you were searching for something in London. So it will show you the road, but it will not show you the actual building number. And it will it's pointed down like at a midpoint on that road, and there might be nothing there. And I think that has maybe led people to look at what is there when they see that sort of, when they've typed in this full address, Baidu has put down a point saying like, yes, it's here. And it's like, it's a weird factory building, or it's like, there's just nothing there. And they've maybe concluded from that, oh, like that really is the address. And like, there's just something, the Chinese government has done something weird, because there are many, many reasons to distrust what the Chinese government says. But I think it's actually about the way that maps work in China. And that's what has led to those thoughts.
And if you put Textile Road, London, you would get a dot, as you're saying, you'd get a pin in the middle point of Textile Road, London. You wouldn't get, so
yeah, no, exactly.
Exactly. Yeah. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, and then another question that sort of extends this thread just a step further before we switch tacks a little bit. Someone's asked, surely people have died, and have you located necropolis structures or graveyards? And I want to extend that question with one of my own, which I think is an important question that this work begs, which is, do you see evidence of execution? Are these simply re-education camps, or are these, is there, what are your thoughts on whether there is something more happening?
We don't believe that these are death camps. We haven't seen evidence of that. Okay. As for people dying in the camps, we have heard isolated reports of that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know, people, and I mean, sadly, I mean, horrendous that those people have died in the first place. But often, like, the family will only hear about it a couple of years later. You know, they'll have been like searching for news of their loved one, and then finally they get it confirmed, like they were in a camp. Oh, but by the way, they died in 2018, which just must be is horrifying to think about. Beyond that, we know that people are not treated particularly well in the camps generally. You know, they lack adequate food, they lack medical care, and we know that you know, we've from the detainees in Mongol Kure that we spoke to, you know, they told a story of one guy who one of the men shared a cell with, who became very, very sick, and to the point, you know, they were begging the gods to allow this guy to just lie down during the day, and eventually they relented. But the idea that, you know, he was sick and he wasn't even allowed to rest is already appalling. But yeah, he became very sick, and at one point they took him away and they didn't see him again. And whether he was released, whether he was taken to hospital, you know, people just don't know. And that really speaks to the lack of information that we have about what's going on in the camps. That sort of lack of accountability, and that lack of transparency about who is detained and why and for how long and where.
Thank you. So switching tacks a little bit, there are a number of questions from students that I want to pass on. The first is, how do you balance a desire for a long-term career working in China, or perhaps in other sensitive areas, while wanting to tackle sensitive human rights topics? Also, this is a two-part question from the same student. Also, other than lack of confirmation given by eyewitness reports, what is the biggest issue or challenge for you in working primarily with satellite imagery?
Okay, so would I mean, I don't, it's funny, I've actually never been to China. Mega has obviously and has a huge amount of knowledge. So I work with people who have and who do know all of this, but I've personally never been to China. And I'm absolutely like fascinated. I would be fascinated to go. And yet, because of everything that's happening and because of the way the Chinese authorities have been reacting to journalists over the past few years, I'm very, very reluctant to go. I don't have a need to go. And so I think I wouldn't. What we've seen is, we've seen like the New York Times has been kicked out. We've seen Australian journalists detained, one of them for well over a year now. We've seen other journalists given exit bans, which is, I think, a very serious risk, and would be very, very unpleasant if that happened to you. And for those reasons, I'm not really willing to go to China. Although I would love to, because I'm really curious about the place now. I've studied it so intensely. I'm basically just resigned to the fact that I'll never get to go. It was basically the constraint on this work from the outset. We can't go to Xinjiang, like how can we investigate it? And that was really what led us down the path that we've taken and the investigations that we've done. So it's not something that I worry about too much. I feel like I have enough opportunity here where I am, and I feel safe and secure enough where I am that I don't feel that I need to worry about the lack of opportunity to, for example, go and work in Shanghai or whatever. So that's how I feel. That's how I think about that. Yeah. The challenges of working with satellite imagery. I guess at the beginning, the challenge is that satellite imagery relies on like a familiarity with the place, and it relies on sort of association to allow you to interpret what you're seeing and work out what it is that you're looking at. And so the initial challenge was in sort of building up that knowledge about like what China and what Xinjiang looked like and how things tend to work, and therefore whether a place was a camp or not and whether it was suspicious or not. So I learned a huge amount from other researchers. I learned a huge amount from Sean Zhang, who I talked about earlier, who was the guy who found the tender documents and went and tracked down the first camps. He did amazing work. I also learned a lot from Nathan Ruza, who is he's a researcher at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. So yeah, like learning from other people's work, and people were very generous in sort of taking the time to do a call and answer questions. So yeah, like that.
The next question comes again from a student. Excuse me, please. As an art historian / art history student, in what way can we contribute to this forensic architecture related operation, since we do not have 3D modeling skills like an architect or the firsthand experience like journalists, etc.?
I think that, sorry, I was just getting distracted by a question coming up on screen. I think that you start from where you are, and actually you will build the skills in doing the work. You know, I didn't start out on this project with a huge amount of knowledge about Xinjiang, and that is something that I have built over the past 3 years, and I've learned a huge amount from Mega. I've learned a huge amount from Crystal. I've learned a huge amount from other researchers working in this field, and I've also sort of built my skills as I've gone. And so I would say that you can as well. And I mean, also, you know, I wouldn't do down the skills that an art historian has. You know, the ability to look very closely at visual information and interpret that is incredibly useful. You know, we're increasingly working with these very visual forms of information, whether it's satellite imagery or photography or videos. And an art historian would have a lot of the skills necessary to start doing that sort of analysis.
Well, I want to say, I mean, and I really appreciate the idea that we start with from where we are, and we go out from there and we ask the questions that are presented to us. But I am struck by how much similarity there is between what you're describing and the types of things that we practice as art historians. And you know, for those students, you know, who are listening tonight, the identification of fences and guardhouses as key indicators of a camp is not so dissimilar to iconographic analysis of a wide variety of types. You're looking for key markers that indicate a type of structure. And I mean, I found one of my first questions in the opening of your talk was, how on earth do you figure out the typology of buildings? And what you revealed over the course of your talk was a combination of slowly developing an educated guess and then corroborating it against other things, and a certain amount of sort of very situated development of knowledge. So I think that this is really interesting. One of the things I also find very exciting about this work is this is not specifically true of yours, and I don't mean this in any way as to diminish the work, but as there is a sort of almost crowdsourced quality that there is as you said, Google Earth is a generally available tool. This is stuff that is not controlled by the state or by, I mean, it is controlled by Google, which is not a stateless type of event, but there is a certain sort of open access quality of this that is very exciting, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's something that I should say as well. It's like people sometimes imagine that we have, that all of the tools are sort of these very secret, very expensive things, but in fact, we're typically using free software and publicly available data sets, whether that was, you know, a lot of our satellite imagery came from Google Earth, but we also used the European Space Agency's Sentinel Hub Playground to access their imagery. So we have like imagery for pretty much the entire Earth every 2 or 3 days, which is just incredible. And that allowed us to track the process of construction of these camps. And it's free, everyone can access it. Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you for showing us. Sorry, I have not used European Space Agency data before, so now I'm going to go look it up. But I also want to thank you for showing us in Google Earth, because I think that you know, it is for those who are interested in spatial architectural questions, even ones with much lower stakes than the type of work you're doing, it's an extraordinarily flexible and interesting tool from which you can see a huge amount. Okay, yeah. I better keep going. How do you think Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslim minorities in China see or understand the value of your work? And that actually connects to an earlier question, which I think essentially is, how aware are people in China, and perhaps particularly people in Xinjiang, of your work? Do you know?
So I don't have a very clear sense. I mean, there's quite a large Uyghur diaspora community, and certainly we're in touch with quite a lot of those people. you know, that there's a lot of sort of like activists and lawyers in that community who are also sort of trying to, you know, bring together evidence and sort of and put pressure on the Chinese government to act, or to stop what is happening, rather. Yes, I mean, and the diaspora community is definitely aware of our work. Within China, I mean, information is very heavily controlled in China. BuzzFeed is not censored, and GitHub is not censored either. And so we've made a point of putting our articles on GitHub. That's something we did initially, and then also putting our data around these are the locations of the camps, putting that up on GitHub as well. So that we could try and make sure that this is reasonably available to people in China. We know that at points this work gets discussed on Chinese social media, although I don't speak Chinese well enough to follow those discussions, and I don't have access to those accounts. But we know, for example, that after the Mongol Kure story created a huge amount of discussion, also because the detainees who spoke to us were anonymous, and there were people who were desperately trying to find out who they were, and were really quite angry that we had produced any sort of coverage that was critical of China. That seemed to be driving a lot of the sort of anger around that. So it does get discussed, but we don't. I don't have a very clear sense of what's being said or who's saying it, and I don't really have a way to enter into those conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think you highlight someone. I just would take this moment. You declined to answer a question earlier, which is very understandable, and I've skipped a couple of potentially sensitive questions. And someone has asked in the chat whether Chatham House rules are in place for this talk. Now, part of the problem is that as an American, I actually, so I was quickly Googling Chatham House rules because I don't quite know what that means. Maybe you do, Alison. Maybe you can help me.
Oh, it means that you can report what's said in the discussion, but you can't attribute it to who's speaking. I mean, as this talk is being recorded, and you know, all the publicity sort of has, you know, described me as the speaker. So, in terms of what I say, I'm happy to be quoted. But perhaps other people raising questions aren't.
Well, and I will say that normally the chat I believe is not visible in the recording, and I normally name the people who have asked questions when I do online chats, and I have not tonight. And I think that it is that was sort of why I did that. But as Alison says, this is recorded and it will be online, and of course her work is very well published. Another person, so thank you for helping me with that, because I thought that was what it meant, but I didn't quite understand the full implications of it. Someone else writes, as I'm new to the notion of online investigation, I was wondering if there are currently efforts to analyze the past with similar techniques and what the potential for that might be. And I would expand that generally to other people whose, I mean, I'd love for you to answer if you know of historic subjects, but also other people whose work you've mentioned a couple, but in other parts of the world or in other ways is interesting or inspiring to you in terms of thinking about how you go about this. Those are two big questions.
I mean, I guess like Bellingcat are the people who really like blazed this trail, and they've been going, I think they started around 10 years ago, and they really sort of pioneered many of the techniques that people like me are using and sort of building on, and they were the first people to really look at social media and to start taking seriously what it might be possible to do with it. So their work is incredible. I'd I'd highly recommend people to check that out. And then like the historical investigations. I mean, I think it really depends on the amount of data that you have available. And when I say data, I mean sort of everything from sort of documents to photographs to maps to satellite imagery. And I guess that is going to depend very heavily on when the thing that you want to investigate happened. In fact, like this is really starting to sound like the sort of work that historians do, looking at primary sources and looking through archives and looking at the photographs and things like that. I think that there's definitely similarities. I think that what has made what the sort of work that I'm doing maybe different is just like it's the volume of information that's available, and the way in which that tends to be publicly available. I mean, not completely. There have been issues, for example, of YouTube taking down many of the videos which were documenting what was happening in the civil war in Syria. So it's not universally true that there's tons of data available, but that sort of amount of this sort of like almost overwhelming amount of data that's often available around events now, and also the format of data which is available, that it tends to be sort of video and photography. That's a really big change.
Yeah. I just to add to, thank you. That's a really interesting and useful answer. Just to add to that from my own work using satellite on historical topics, it can be very useful for a whole variety of reasons. But one of the things that is, when looking at landscape and space through satellite, is that the Earth changes. Shorelines change, hill formations, mountains change, and it's incredible how quickly the Earth goes from looking one way to being changed to looking like it's always been that way. And so working with satellite imagery for historic topics, especially around the landscape, needs a lot of corroborating evidence to understand how things have moved. And so just to add to that, because I think that it is something, you're also often working with the exact opposite, which is a real paucity of evidence as opposed to a surfeit of evidence, such as what you have here. A couple more questions. Is the Kazakh government or other Central Asian governments close to Xinjiang willing to intervene? This person goes on to write, many of the detainees recently covered by Western media were in the process of becoming Kazakh citizens or already were living in Kazakhstan when they were coached back to Xinjiang or banned from leaving Xinjiang because they had traveled there. Maybe you can address that question.
Yeah, so Kazakhstan actually has taken a bit of a stand to defend both its citizens and its residents, and especially sort of like the ethnic Kazakhs. There was a trial in 2018, I think, for a woman who Kazakhstan had sort of wanted to send back, and she successfully argued that she, having been in a camp, she was at very high risk of persecution and torture and perhaps death should she be sent back. And the Kazakhstan government at that point agreed to extend protection to her and to allow her to stay. And it's done that with a number of people in that situation now. So yes, they have taken a stand to a certain extent, but it's challenging because China is a very significant power in that region. Yeah. And in the world as well.
Yeah. There's a question about the sort of reliability or the potential problems of data that you're using. I mean, for instance, I guess this is a larger data question. is Google, despite saying do no harm or whatever the motto is, be nice, I can't remember what Google's motto is. How do you feel about the problems or pitfalls of data like Google Earth satellite imagery? Or are there problems or pitfalls? Or do you see satellite imagery as a sort of neutral data set?
Oh, I mean, there's no such thing as a neutral data set, right? I mean, I guess the main biases that we see in that data set is where it gets photographed and how frequently and how often that imagery is updated. That's the main challenge that I've seen in our work. Yeah, I mean, the satellite imagery is not without it's not without sort of political control of what happens with it. So, for example, for quite some time, there was a law in the US which said that you weren't allowed to provide satellite imagery of Israel at a high resolution. So imagery of Israel was at this sort of medium resolution. It was, you couldn't even see car. I think it was at a resolution where like 1 pixel would be the size of a car. So it was really quite difficult to see a lot of what was going on. Certainly you didn't have anything like the detail that we've been lucky enough to have in Xinjiang. And that law recently expired. And so it may be that there is now satellite imagery at high resolution of Israel. But that's one example of political controls over this sort of data. When there was a battle around Raqqa in the north of Syria in sort of 2017, 2018, and while that was going on, the US military also bought up all of the satellite imagery of that area, and it was so that they would have a huge amount of information, but it was also to deny that information to their opponents. So that's another way in which satellite imagery can be manipulated. Yeah, and then I mean, I actually think Google Earth is a really great tool, and Google has provided a huge amount of satellite imagery to the public for free, and that's an absolutely amazing resource. Beyond that, there really aren't that many places that you can go for good high resolution imagery, and the cost of obtaining that imagery is often prohibitive. So it's actually a really amazing resource.
So thank you very much. Quickly, can you point us towards, and I want to note that we will, in an email that we'll send out in the next day or two to everybody, thanking you for coming, we'll include some of the names and references that Alison has mentioned, of other people who are doing similar work and stuff like this, so that if you haven't written it down, we can provide some of it for you. Someone's asked whether there are references to accounts by those who have formally been in the count. You've talked about interviews, which obviously some of them Maga has done herself, but are there also other places where some of this has been published that you can point us towards, like accounts of camps?
Accounts of camps. Yeah, actually there's a resource called the Xinjiang Victims Database, which has collated a huge amount of individual sort of first-person accounts of their camps. Some of those accounts are more detailed than others. Some are very simple, a person's name and their age and their occupation and what their family believe has happened to them and where it is believed that they've been held. Others are much lengthier and sort of talk about the experience of the camps, but that's a really incredible resource. There's been quite a lot of media as well. For all of the sort of mainstream news organizations have covered this.
Well, thank you. I just really want to take a moment to thank you again for, we've put you through the ringer in a very long Q&A, but thank you for an extraordinarily enlightening and thought-provoking evening, and thank you for joining us. I also want to thank all of you who came and say this is our second and final talk for this term in Art History Futures, but we will be reconvening on the 18th of January to hear from two leaders in the Hokusai project at the British Museum, Dominic Oldman and Tim Clark, who are working on a digitization project at the British Museum, focus on Hokusai prints. And then we'll be returning to two more spatial projects, building on what Alison has spoken to tonight, from Susan Gagliardi, Mapping Sanufo project, looking at African geographies of African art, and then Paul Jaskett, who I mentioned earlier in the Q&A, and his new work on Krakow. So those are all coming up in spring term. Alison, thank you again for joining us, and very best wishes for your work.
Cool. Thank you so much for having me. So it's been great. I put my Twitter handle in the chat as well. If people have questions or anything, you can find me there.
Oh, terrific. Thank you very much. Yes, that's really great. Thank you again. Have a great evening, everyone, and we'll see you soon. Take care.
Yeah, thank you. Good night.